Hey, thanks for joining me. Today's video is about the infinite game applied to medical research. This topic is rather important to me. I work in the medical research field and I've been thinking about this topic for a while. And so I wanted to share a few thoughts. The infinite game is not my concept at all. I really need to refer to James Cars, who wrote the Finite and Infinite Games in 1987, and also to Simon Sinek, who wrote the Infinite Game in 2018. Both are wonderful books. Simon has a number of YouTube videos that explain the infinite game in the context of the business world in general. First, I need to start with a disclaimer. I was employed by the MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston, Texas. The views expressed in this video are solely my own views. The MD Anderson Cancer Center does not endorse my views. I want to add that the MD Anderson Cancer Center required me to include this disclaimer in my video. And to reinforce their point, I will be talking about a just cause, having courageous leadership, and having trusting teams. Therefore, the MD Anderson Cancer Center has elected to specifically not endorse my views about having a just cause, having courageous leadership, and having trusting teams. I'll let you decide what type of cause, leadership, and teams they do endorse. All right, so why is there friction between clinical operations and research at medical centers? I work at a medical center, and I know many colleagues who work at other medical centers with clinical operations. And this problem is common at almost all of our medical centers. Our medical centers consist of a hospital that is treating patients and acting as a healthcare business. And I will refer to hospitals as healthcare businesses to emphasize that point. And I am including the senior leadership of a medical school as part of the healthcare business rather than the medical research area, because the medical school itself is a business that manages teaching, administrative activities, regulatory issues, and so on, as well as research. All right, and then there are researchers like me who are embedded in a medical center and who are trying to develop new treatments and diagnostic methods for many pathological diseases, including cancer and cardiovascular diseases, neurological diseases, musculoskeletal diseases, metabolic diseases such as diabetes, and also infections and also injuries. An inherent friction exists between the healthcare business and the research developments at a medical center. And one reason for this friction can be explained by the idea of the finite game versus the infinite game. And I would like to explain why we can use that concept of finite and infinite games to bring these two groups together to reduce this friction. Okay, so what is a finite game? Well, as an analogy, I enjoy American football, which is clearly a finite game. Football has defined rules that the teams have agreed to in advance. They have known competitors because each football team is very aware of the other football teams in the league, and there are no additional football teams that join the league. It's very rare for the league to expand and add more teams. Very importantly, each football game is a direct competition that ends with a winner and a loser. There are rare exceptions where the game ends in a tie. I think that almost all healthcare businesses, like other businesses, play a finite game. They have defined rules about how the workflow of providing diagnosis and treatments should occur. They get reimbursed based upon these rules. I've been in meetings where physicians are clearly optimizing the process to generate a high reimbursement legally within the reimbursement rules, and it is implied that the optimization is just good business. Business administration of the hospital plays by defined rules of accounting for their finances, and then there are predefined rules for gauging success, such as monitoring the survival rates of patients and quality of life metrics for patients. Hospitals have known competitors, such as other local hospitals and also hospitals on a statewide or national scale that specialize in the same healthcare area, such as a nationally designated cancer center network. Each hospital is a business that must stay solvent to pay employees, cover infrastructure costs, afford to buy supplies, maintain equipment, and so on. And therefore, each hospital is truly competing with other hospitals for the finite amount of dollars available for healthcare through health insurance and other direct payments from patients. Anytime there is a finite supply of resources, There will always be a direct competition in life. There's an endpoint with a winner and loser. Financially, there's a lot to gain in the healthcare industry. For example, I've heard that 20% of annual profits at some healthcare businesses, such as the MD Anderson Cancer Center, which is an amazingly high rate. Even 10% is considered to be a solid profit margin at many businesses. Those highly profitable healthcare businesses are the winners, and of course the losers are healthcare businesses that become insolvent and may even go out of business. Now, there are polls and surveys that are taken every year to evaluate the competing healthcare companies. There are annual polls that announce that a single hospital or healthcare business is number one in a particular medical area of cancer, and that institution can proudly cheer that they are number one. For example, hooray, we're number one in cancer. Hooray, we won cancer. But if you think about it, nobody really wins cancer, and I'll get back to this point. All right, so I'm a medical researcher and I play an infinite game, and almost all medical researchers play an infinite game. First, there are no set rules for our game. There are evolving ways to do research with new technologies and new scientific concepts invented or developed over time. As an example, I develop imaging methods with magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI, and also with positron emission tomography, also known as PET. About 20 years ago, it would have been difficult to anticipate that these two imaging methods could be combined to perform simultaneous PET MRI diagnoses. But these two methods were indeed combined, and I was very fortunate to have one of the first PET MRI instruments for imaging small animal models of cancer starting about 10 years ago. And this new capability evolved the rules for imaging cancer. And that's just one of many examples, a seemingly infinite number of examples of how our academic research field can evolve. Also, I feel that I don't have research competitors, and instead I have worthy rivals. I really like that phrase, worthy rivals, because I learn from worthwhile research performed by my colleagues, and hopefully my research is worthy enough that other researchers can learn from me. I value the worth of my colleagues when they're awarded a grant for funding, when they publish a research manuscript, when they deliver an oral presentation at a meeting, when they recruit new members to their research group. And hopefully they value my worth when I'm successful as well. So the reason for this feeling of worth in others is because having a colleague succeed in research will foster a greater chance for me to succeed in my research, and vice versa. If we learn from each other and even collaborate at various levels, then we will win this infinite game long term. Well, we're not direct competitors. Also, I don't know all my worthy rivals. Each time I attend a scientific conference, I meet new researchers who are typically earlier in their research careers than me. They may be from a very different academic background. It could be impossible to anticipate that they would join the same research field in which I focus. I have transitioned from one imaging research field to another, from MRI to optoacoustic imaging. And I think that many of the traditional researchers in optoacoustic imaging didn't anticipate my research transition. I was initially unknown to them. There's a seemingly infinite number of new researchers who could potentially join my research field, optoacoustic imaging, in every given year. So, most importantly, to play the infinite game, it's important to realize that there is no end point to the game. The goal is not to win the game, but the goal is to just stay in the game for as long as possible. I know research colleagues who have worked in academic research well past the age of retirement of 65 years old and often work into their early 70s or even late 70s. I like to say that I'll finally retire from research when my wife reminds me that it's time to retire. And when professors retire, they become emeritus professors. Well, what does an emeritus professor do? Well, what they don't do is go to administrative meetings and accounting meetings and so on. Instead, they focus on what they like to do, which is performing research and mentoring early career researchers. And very importantly, one of my goals is to provide a portfolio of accomplishments for other researchers to continue my research, even when I do retire, so that the research never ends, and the research is really an infinite game. Even though I'm a medical researcher who plays an infinite game, I also recognize that I play a finite game. I compete with other researchers for grant funding, I compete to have my work published in a journal, and I compete to be selected to give an oral presentation at a major scientific meeting. I compete to recruit top grad students and postdoc fellows to my research group. And the reason, again, for competition is that these resources are finite. There's a limited amount of grant funding and so on. And unless all resources are unlimited, life will always have a component of a finite game. And I think it's important that I recognize that I'm playing both an infinite game and a finite game. And similarly, I think a healthcare business is playing an infinite game while also firmly playing a finite game. Healthcare businesses are led by very smart people. They don't run a business by random chance that's worth hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars and can generate up to 20% annual profits. And healthcare is complex and complicated and takes a lot of collective intelligence to operate. And I think these very smart leaders of healthcare companies understand they're actually playing a finite game and an infinite game. For example, the MD Anderson Cancer Center has been ranked as the #1 cancer center in the world for many years. The leaders and employees at the MD Anderson Cancer Center cheer, "Hey, we won cancer." Okay, great. And that cheer is a good approach for marketing that can attract more patients. And these patients can then receive award-winning medical care, so this is a positive result. However, the leaders and employees at MD Anderson understand on a deeper level, nobody wins cancer. And there are patients who are in a very difficult situation with their cancer who need good diagnoses and good treatment. The goal at the MD Anderson Cancer Center is to keep patients alive and well for as long as possible, for infinitely long as possible, and then to help these patients and other new patients. Unfortunately, in the cancer field, there are very many patients, and there will continue to be many patients for an infinitely long time. And so the healthcare business has to continue for an infinite time as well. Also, a healthcare business clearly knows the rules of healthcare are constantly evolving. As an example, medical records used to be paper files and were finally digitized earlier this century, which substantially changed the ability to deliver good healthcare. Now, artificial intelligence is becoming a valuable tool for assisting physicians who are making healthcare decisions. In my own field of medical imaging, we're synthesizing molecules that simultaneously diagnose disease and provide therapy for a patient, known as theranostics. And that's a new paradigm that is evolving to improve healthcare as well. Finally, a healthcare business clearly learns about these evolving rules by observing other healthcare businesses. They can even make alliances, a healthcare network in their regional areas. And that's the key for reducing the friction between clinical operations and research at medical centers. The healthcare business side and the medical research side both need to realize that they're both playing a finite game and an infinite game. The healthcare business will be weighted more towards playing a finite game. Medical researchers will be weighted more towards playing an infinite game. Perhaps a 70% to 30% ratio. You could argue about that ratio. Still, both groups are playing both games. If both sides work together and recognize that they're both playing both games, then they can help each other with both types of games. All right, a major problem is that a player of a finite game is often frustrated with, perhaps even offended by, a player of an infinite game. As an analogy, it would cause mayhem if an American football league suddenly had to merge with a European football league or soccer league. Then some hybrid set of football and soccer rules was implemented mid-season and the number of teams in the league suddenly doubled. And it would almost seem inconceivable if this new hybrid league canceled the annual postseason playoffs and championship game and just decided to continue to play games for years, for an infinite amount of time without an end to the season. Wouldn't make sense, right? Similarly, a healthcare business with optimized processes can get frustrated when those processes are disrupted by even the smallest evolution of rules provided by new research technologies and methods. A healthcare business can be very frustrated when they have secrets about their technologies and methods that they don't want to share with their true competitors for finite resources. And then researchers want to share these secrets with their worthy rivals at other institutions to further their research collective goals. And of course, the healthcare business would greatly resist my suggestion that annual reports are just a finite endpoint that are unnecessarily longer term. There's no reason that annual reports are due every 12 months just because the Earth revolves around the sun in 12 months. Timing is rather arbitrary. And yes, I have often made that suggestion. For comparison, a player of the infinite game can often be annoyed by a player of the finite game, but it's not often that the infinite game player is frustrated or offended. For example, when I worked at the MD Anderson Cancer Center, I had to complete many online training modules to ensure that the healthcare business met certain standards for all employees, even if the training about hospital practices was really irrelevant to my research work. I had to file countless confidentiality disclosure agreements, materials transfer agreements, intellectual property documents to protect our internal knowledge from our so-called competitors, even though I did not view my collaborators as competitors. And this regulatory aspect was annoying, sometimes very annoying, but it didn't disrupt my ability to play my infinite game. It only slowed it down. So it's just annoying, not frustrating or offending. A related problem is that the healthcare business that is largely playing the finite game is set up to have most of the power relative to the medical researcher who is largely playing an infinite game. Research needs many resources, including equipment, lab space, supplies, research and hospital facilities. Clinical studies need patients, and these resources are all owned and managed by the healthcare business. Even a research grant that is awarded to a medical researcher, such as myself, is not owned by the researcher, and instead the grant money is legally owned by the healthcare business. Therefore, if the healthcare business is largely playing a finite game, and they are frustrated by a medical researcher who is largely playing an infinite game, and the healthcare business has most of the power in the relationship, well, the healthcare business tends to box in the medical researcher into their finite game rather than deal with the frustration of playing more of an infinite game. This is a short-term win for the healthcare business, no question, but I think this is a failing strategy for a healthcare business longer term. Okay, so how can we address the friction between the clinical operations of a healthcare company and the medical researchers? How do we reduce the friction that the finite game healthcare business can experience when interacting with the infinite game medical researcher? And I think the key is to help the finite game business understand the benefits of playing the infinite game. And the healthcare business does not have to change its weighting between playing the finite game and infinite game. Instead, the goal is to work synergistically with the medical researchers so that the collective whole has a good balance, perhaps that collective 50-50% balance. Then the medical center can be successful playing both games. And the benefits of an infinite game lie in 5 characteristics of how to play the infinite game. All 5 characteristics are needed or the process will slide completely back into the finite game. And the benefits of also playing an infinite game will be lost. Okay, here's a spoiler alert. The solution for reducing the friction on both sides is simply to improve communication. Communication should be founded on discussing these 5 characteristics of the infinite game, and to be honest, it's really that simple. Active, bidirectional communication can be rather difficult in practice, especially if the healthcare company has most of the power and can easily become frustrated. They'll just shut down and not want to have that communication. But that simple solution of better communication is the best way to address this friction. And in fact, I'd like to add that sometimes being part of a company is like being married to that company. And I enjoy being married to my wife. On occasion, there is friction between myself and my wife. And the way to address that friction is communication, right? If you just don't talk about it and let the problem fester, it's only going to get worse. It's not going to get any better for sure. Same thing if you have friction between the medical researcher and the healthcare company that you're married to. The best solution, in my opinion, is to have better communication. Okay, so the first characteristic of playing this infinite game has been shown on the slide for a while, is to have a just cause. And this cause has to be so great that everyone on the team is willing to sacrifice to achieve that cause. Cause has to be very well justified, must be so just that everyone can understand the cause. It's important that a just cause is not yet realized. It may never be fully realized. This condition is easily met in the healthcare industry and in medical research because healthcare will always be needed. Now, we will never fully win cancer or win any other disease, well, except for successfully eradicating some types of infectious diseases. I'd like to add my personal view that a just cause focuses on people and has to include emotion. For example, I can get excited some days about visiting a new place, going for a walk or a bicycle ride, or watching my favorite Green Bay Packers play a football game. But these activities are finite, and I'm no longer excited after these activities end. For comparison, if I help another person or I help many people, then that emotional feeling of excitement about helping people lasts a much longer time, perhaps infinitely long. I think that's why many of us enjoy the field of teaching, because we're helping younger, early career researchers to evolve into what they want to be. And that's very emotional to help these younger people to get to their next goal. Okay, at the MD Anderson Cancer Center, it's easy to conclude that the just cause is to cure cancer patients. A focus on curing cancer is well defined. It's a finite goal. If a cancer is initially cured, then MD Anderson is a winner. 5-year survival rate accounts for tumor recurrence and is also used as a metric of success. But even 5 years is a finite time frame. If MD Anderson cures more cancer patients than a competing hospital based on these finite metrics, then MD Anderson wins over that other hospital, and yay, they're number one. Okay, curing cancer is financially rewarding and very rewarding with a huge profit. However, the cause of curing cancer focuses on the cancer and not necessarily on the people, the patient. So curing cancer is not the real just cause at the MD Anderson Cancer Center. Instead, the just cause is to improve the lives of cancer patients. Improve the lives of cancer patients. Here's a hypothetical story that explains why. If I developed a new treatment for brain cancer with a 100% cure rate, it would seem obvious that the MD Anderson Cancer Center would certainly implement the treatment in their clinical operations for curing cancer. However, what would happen if the treatment involved electroshock therapy to the brain, severe sleep deprivation in a freezing room, and perhaps even hanging the patient upside down until they passed out from the pain of the blood rushing to their head? There's no way the MD Anderson Cancer Center would torture their patients in this way. And that shows that the true just cause is to improve the lives of patients who have cancer. And the cause focuses on the patient, the people, and also helping people to live longer and with a higher quality of life is a very emotional experience. As a researcher, that's my just cause as well, to improve the lives of cancer patients. For example, I'm developing a new imaging method that can diagnose breast cancer that is faster for the patient, it's more comfortable for the patient, and can be used in low and middle income countries where many breast cancer patients are remaining undiagnosed. And of course, I want all breast cancer patients to be cured, but I'm first focused on helping the patient and then focused on the cancer cure as part of helping the patient. And this gets me excited to get out of bed in the morning. The chance to cure cancer is just a task, and the chance to help patients is emotional. It could be argued that having a just cause of improving the lives of patients is hardly specific. It's only slightly more specific than improving the lives of all people. In fact, everyone is a potential patient because everyone eventually needs some type of medical care. And this is a problem because any business can have a just cause of improving the lives of people, right? No kidding. I could be a tax accountant, I could sell popcorn, I could be an air traffic controller, and I'm just improving the lives of people. Therefore, a just cause has to be more specific about the medical care for the patients. Can a healthcare business simply have a general just cause for improving the lives of patients? Well, sure, over the short term. But I think this approach is not sustainable due to the evolution of medical research and medical practice over time, which is more of an infinite game. I have to admit that a specific just cause for an entire medical center is almost impossible, even for the MD Anderson Cancer Center that focuses only on patients who have cancer. Let's be honest, right? 150 years ago, a single doctor could treat an entire small town. Now medical centers are the size of a small town. And therefore, this problem of having a just cause for specific patients should be applied at the level of a division or a department. And that's where medical researchers and healthcare businesses can communicate to make a more specific just cause for the longer term for this infinite game. Unfortunately, this communication is often absent, and if it exists, it's usually unidirectional from the healthcare business leaders to the medical researchers. Active, bi-directional communication is needed to bridge that gap between the finite game players and the infinite game players, again, at this divisional or departmental levels in a medical center. And that's the solution. It's surprisingly simple. Just more open communication should lead to a more specific refinement of a just cause for each division or department. Recognizing a common just cause can reduce the friction between both sides. Okay, the second characteristic of playing the infinite game is to have worthy rivals. I've already discussed the idea of worthy rivals, so I won't dwell extensively on this point. A healthcare business can be stronger long-term when it can learn from other healthcare companies. Part of this business-to-business learning process can occur through inter-institutional collaborations between medical researchers. There should be more sharing of research between medical researchers to foster relationships between these worthy rivals. There should be more communication between the healthcare business and the medical researchers about these inter-institutional interactions, because providing more knowledge to the healthcare business through these communications could reduce the friction between both sides. So I think that's quite important. The third characteristic of playing the infinite game is to practice existential flexibility. And this is the most difficult point to address for a healthcare business that is primarily playing a finite game. An existential change is not just an incremental improvement to existing practices, but it is a profound, major change to existing paradigms in current practice. Major change costs money and time and negatively impacts an annual goal of the finite game. And even if a major change is not implemented in a given year, having the flexibility for existential change weakens the ability to win the finite game. However, this flexibility for existential change strengthens the outcome of an infinite game. And hopefully that's obvious. Examples of successful existential flexibility include Apple's strategic pivot to invent the computer mouse and a graphical user interface, which has revolutionized personal computers. Netflix pivoted to video streaming, which revolutionized home movie entertainment. And both of these profound changes cost each company money and time, which were bad decisions in the short term of the finite game. But obviously, these were exceptional decisions in the long-term infinite game. An example of an inflexible resistance to existential change is the digital camera, which Kodak initially invented. But then they ignored the technology because digital photography would eliminate camera film, and the film industry was highly profitable for Kodak. So Kodak made a good short-term decision in a finite game, but a terrible decision in a longer-term infinite game. Other companies eventually caught up to Kodak regarding digital camera technology. Camera film market collapsed and, well, Kodak went bankrupt. Healthcare has experienced similar existential changes. An obvious example is the invention of immunotherapy for treating cancer, which has improved cure rates for many types of cancer. Another example is my own field of medical imaging, where mammography and colonoscopy has revolutionized cancer detection. In fact, X-ray mammography is so good at detecting cancer lesions that when mammography was first implemented widely in the 1990s, there were concerns that X-ray mammography had radiation that caused breast cancer because the breast cancer detection rate suddenly increased. Well, these concerns that mammography caused breast cancer was subsequently shown to be false in well-controlled scientific studies. MRI and PET imaging are other examples of imaging methods that have revolutionized cancer detection and monitoring anti-cancer treatments. The key to reducing friction between the healthcare business and the medical researchers is to communicate about common interests in existential change, which can then promote the flexibility in the medical center for these existential changes. 30 years ago, if a healthcare business focused on cancer care and could see into the future and realize how immunotherapy and medical imaging would revolutionize their business, well, they would certainly invest in those technologies and play that infinite game. The problem is that predicting the future is difficult, and unfortunately, the healthcare business has the power, as I mentioned before, and therefore makes these decisions about the investment. But the healthcare business leaders who make the decisions about existential flexibility seldom have the scientific background or deep scientific understanding of each field. And that's not a criticism, because nobody can be great at all aspects of leading a healthcare business and medical research in all fields of medical research. And so instead, there should be more bidirectional communication between business leaders and medical researchers. And again, that should be occurring at the division or departmental levels, so there can be a deep understanding about each of these specific areas. And that can address this existential flexibility. It really is a simple solution that can reduce friction. So I would like to share two stories that really emphasize this point. Now, you may think that existential flexibility is a bit of a lofty idea, but it really is a real phenomenon. I've often encountered resistance when I've tried to promote the flexibility for existential change in medical practice. For example, I arranged for a $400,000 optoacoustic imaging instrument that can detect lesions that have low levels of oxygen, which is a hallmark of a cancer lesion. And this new imaging machine is very similar to a very common ultrasound imaging instrument. However, because the technology was new, the hospital personnel at the MD Anderson Cancer Center were frustrated and even offended by this change. They did not want the instrument within their environment for clinical observations. Over the short term of the finite game, research with this new imaging machine would only slow down their profitable workflow in the ultrasound imaging clinic, and I can understand that. However, the goal of my optoacoustic imaging research is to replace MRI for breast cancer screening. Optoacoustic imaging is faster and is a much more convenient procedure than MRI, so that optoacoustic imaging would improve the lives of the medical personnel and their patients over the longer term infinite game. And yet I had a lot of difficulty in trying to explain this potential existential change to healthcare professionals who were only focused on the finite game and did not want to communicate about longer term improvements to their business. These healthcare professionals had most of the power. They controlled the research space, the supplies, and the patients, and they didn't want to change. I recently encountered another example where I arranged for a PET MRI imaging instrument for research studies. I developed a partnership with a company that would include the instrument and arranged for all the financing to purchase the instrument at a major discount. This new instrument would have addressed a major deficiency in my institution's research infrastructure and allow many new research studies that could improve human health. However, the healthcare business leadership rejected this partnership. There was a risk that the instrument users could not cover the cost of operating the instrument during the first year. It would take some time to develop a community of users who would routinely use this new instrument. And other institutions have this type of instrument and have had no problems developing a strong community of users, but this indeed can take a year to develop. Therefore, the healthcare leadership focused on the short-term finite game, especially the annual accounting, and didn't recognize the existential change that this new instrument would bring to medical research during a longer-term infinite game. This problem was compounded by very poor communication between the healthcare leadership and researchers who would use the new instrument. The senior leadership actually forbid any direct communication with them or any communication between departments to discuss the research community that would use the instrument. And this example, which I know sounds ridiculous, actually occurred, and it shows that communication is really essential for partnering with players of the finite game to show the merits of playing both the finite game and the infinite game. Otherwise, the finite game players can only win short term, and I think my institution is at risk for losing out on the infinite game longer term. So the fourth characteristic of playing the infinite game is building trusting teams. I like the quote from Theodore Roosevelt, "People don't care what you know until they know how much you care." And as a medical researcher who leads a research group, I invest a lot of time and effort to help each team member with their careers as well as with their research. And this also applies to collaborations between research groups. I like to say that a sign of a good research collaboration is when each person is looking out for the interests of the other person. However, I feel that there is a severe absence of trust between the healthcare business and the medical researchers in a medical center. There's no distrust, which would be a fear that one side is acting against the interests of the other side, but there's no positive feeling of trust. Part of the lack of the trust is due to a lack of interactions. This is a general problem in all professions, in my opinion, which are caused by social media that's replaced a lot of in-person interactions. Also, the COVID-19 pandemic brought a culture of virtual meetings where we focus on the agenda, and we don't include that time before or after the meeting to build a rapport with others. Now, I wouldn't advocate for artificial team building exercises or more social events that can feel somewhat unproductive. But are these trusting teams needed? Well, I think medical centers have existed for years, even centuries, without necessarily having trust between the healthcare business and the medical researchers. Yet I would argue that trust is needed for two reasons. First, healthcare and medical research has become more complex over time, and trusting teams are needed to address this complexity. And second, and more importantly, members of a trusting team often ask, well, what's in it for us as a team? Well, a lack of trust causes the natural human reaction for an individual to ask, well, what's in it for me? And clearly, a healthcare business as well as medical researchers are better off longer term by working together than working separately. There's often a long-term synergy if a healthcare business and medical researchers can work together. And I like this unverified quote from Ben Franklin, "We must all hang together, or assuredly we shall all hang separately." The solution is, again, very simple. We need more communication between the healthcare business leaders and the medical researchers at the division or departmental levels to build these trusting teams. As an example, I have to admit that my experience when trying to arrange for a new PET MRI instrument was met with a lack of communication, and that's caused me to lose trust in the leadership of my healthcare business. Discussions about a specific just cause, learning from worthy rivals, and existential flexibility at the division or department level can be the foundation for this good communication. And these discussions should occur in person to foster trusting teams. And building this trust can be the most important way to reduce friction between both sides. The fifth and final characteristic of playing the infinite game is courageous leadership. Leadership is different than being a leader. I've met many people who have the title of a leader, have the authority of a leader, but who are not really providing leadership. They're managers. They're managing from the rear and telling others what to do and not leading from the front where they can provide a path for others to succeed. I mean this quite literally. I was a bicyclist when I was much younger, and I would ride in a peloton, a main pack of riders that are bunched together to reduce air drag, and we would often ride at 25 to 28 miles per hour for long stretches of time. And pedaling at the front of the peloton is exhausting work and could only be done for a shorter time until someone else would take a pull at the front. And so we had a saying in the peloton, either you're leading or you're in the way. In other words, either you're a leader who's putting in all of your energy to help others, or you should not be a leader. Based upon my bicycling experience, I like the perspective that leadership is not about being in charge, but taking care of people in your charge. So there's a difference between leadership and courageous leadership. A courageous leader can take care of people in their charge through the unconditional offer of their own time and effort. And so here's an example. Now, once upon a time, not so long ago, a faculty colleague had a problem with a refrigerator in his lab, and the refrigerator contained flammable chemicals. And a staff member and a grad student in his research group moved the chemicals to another refrigerator that was also rated for flammables, so the problem was largely solved. However, there was still some chemical residue in the refrigerator, and the graduate student was finishing an experiment, had to focus on the experiment. The staff member needed to leave soon to pick up her son at a daycare. And so the building safety officer contacted my faculty colleague to alert him about the situation, and the refrigerator would be deemed unsafe until it was cleaned. So my colleague replied, "Okay, I'll clean the refrigerator." And the safety officer responded that, well, a professor should, go find someone to clean the refrigerator. He should do professor things like writing a grant or attending an accounting meeting. But my colleague again replied, "It's okay. I'll clean the refrigerator." And so he did that. He took about 20 minutes, if I recall, and just cleaned out the refrigerator. And so my colleague was asking me, was that the right thing to do? And I immediately told him, well, of course. You're not just taking care of the refrigerator. You are taking care of the people who are in your charge. That's courageous leadership. And in the future, your research team will be grateful and feel fortunate to work for you as a courageous leader. And he kind of nodded and agreed. Okay, so how does this apply to reducing friction between a healthcare business and medical research? Well, once again, the answer is surprisingly simple. Over a short term, we need leadership in a healthcare business and in medical research to provide an environment for the communication between both sides at the division or departmental level. Over the longer term, we need that courageous leadership that's willing to sacrifice to continue to foster those discussions and perhaps even act upon those discussions. We need leaders who are willing to take a risk to provide a balance between the finite game and the infinite game. Or we need leaders who are willing to address this friction between both sides, rather than just reinforcing this friction. Finally, I'd like to thank the members of my research group at the MD Anderson Cancer Center. I left MD Anderson in March 2024. Our team members have largely moved on to the next steps of their careers, but I'm indebted to them for their collaboration and support during some difficult times. I would like to dedicate this video to them. Thanks for everything.